Hello guys, one of the most popular types of YouTube videos online are actually reaction videos, so someone reacting to something. So I thought, why don't I do something similar, reacting to tutorials of my colleagues and friends online, commenting myself. Do I agree with everything? Maybe I can suggest anything, or maybe I learn something myself. So I will try it based on an article by Benjamin, who is really active in Laravel community recently, and he's really good at writing so-called listicles or step-by-step tutorials emphasizing the main things you need to know about certain topic. And in this case, the topic is testing. So he is listing 10 testing best practices. Do I agree with all of them? Let's find out together. And the first tip by Benjamin is simplify your tests with Pest. And here's an example. Test method and class with PHP unit and much shorter one with Pest. But personally, I don't fully agree that it should be number one on the list. I remember there was a poll in Laravel community what you use PHP unit or Pest, and it was relatively similar, almost 50-50. So it's a personal preference. Yes, Pest is a great tool and I have videos about that, and it makes your code shorter, but it's not necessarily, I wouldn't call it best practice. It's one of the tools you may choose to use. Let's go to the tip number 2, run your tests on the production stack. At first I've read that run tests on production, which is a totally separate topic. But what Benjamin means here is that the testing environment should be identical as possible to your live server. So for example, if your live server is MySQL, you shouldn't run tests on SQLite or other database drivers, similar with caching driver or whatever other configuration you have. PHP versions and stuff like that. That should be identical. Ideally identical on all the environments, your local environments of all of the colleagues on your team, testing and production. So this tip is not that much about testing, but specifically used in context of testing. So I do agree and I encourage you to do what Benjamin says here. Tip number 3, write feature tests, not unit tests. And this is interesting. The term unit test is kind of a global thing, not on Laravel, and it's mostly used to describe automated tests. In Laravel, historically, there are 2 folders, feature tests and unit tests, and in most cases, what developers do in Laravel, they test features. So my opinion is the same as Benjamin's here. So you should write feature tests first, focusing on the most risky and important features like permissions or payments, or just start with the page loading at all with different endpoints and pages. And only in some cases it makes sense to write unit tests for specific units of your application, like service classes and stuff like that. I've seen many projects, open source and closed source, with just feature tests and unit folder is not even present. And that's totally fine in Laravel. The next tip by Benjamin is faking remote services using Laravel HTTP client. Testing third-party APIs is a separate big challenge, and I have an article about that and I will link that in the description below. But what Benjamin is trying to say here is that you should use HTTP fake to avoid the actual HTTP call, the API call, and assume that the API call will be actually successful, and what your test is about to test is your application behavior. An HTTP client of Laravel has a great feature around that. The next tip is to run tests automatically, for example with GitHub Actions, and this is a very good tip, and this unlocks the whole power of automated testing, making it truly automated. So whenever you commit to GitHub repository or make a pull request, for example, from develop branch to the main branch, before the review of the person who is responsible for deploying the project, it will be reviewed by automated tests on the virtual environment of GitHub. It's such a mental relief to know that even if you forgot to launch tests, GitHub will do that for you and will flag anything you missed. Of course, provided that the tests are written and they are good tests. But basically you can configure any MySQL environment, which again should be as identical as possible to your live environment, and then at the end it runs PHP artisan test and tells you if it is successful. Very good tip, especially if you work in a team. The next tip, deploy your code automatically when your tests pass. I wouldn't sign for that. That's my personal opinion, and of course it depends on the projects, on the team, and on the structure and the plan of your deployments in general. In some projects, so-called continuous deployment and many deployments per day are kind of a natural thing. But for smaller projects within smaller teams, I still prefer someone manually clicking the button like stamp of approval that we can actually actually deploy when we need, not automatically. But again, it's a personal preference of the team and depends on the situation. Next, write a test to confirm a bug fix. So whenever the bug happens, the tip is to fix the bug and write the test so it wouldn't repeat. And this is generally a good tip, except for the scenarios where writing that test and preparing all that scenario for some edge case would take a really long time. That's what often happened to me over my career. In some cases, writing automated tests requires a lot of preparation of specific data, specific situation, configuration and stuff like that. So I wouldn't be so religious about this tip. It's a good tip if it's a quick test to write. The next tip, test your views. And this is the code, assert C and assert view is. And in this case, I'm a bit skeptical about that. For example, assert C type email. It may be type email, but in a different field, for example. And in some cases that HTML of the blade is repeating with different like CSS classes repeating in various places. So it's pretty hard to guarantee that, for example, assert C button means the actual button that you're testing for. So in most cases, if you want to test that something is in Blade, I would limit that to basically the most important text pieces, for example, and not the HTML code like in this case. But again, as with everything, it's a personal preference. For that specific case, there's Laravel Dusk for testing within the browser, so you can configure that and then have kind of more features to test different parts of your HTML in the browser. And the final pieces of the advice of Benjamin article is don't overthink your test, and I would totally agree and emphasize if you are at a point with no tests or very minimal, don't think you need to have 100% test coverage or write test for every route and every feature and every blade view or livewire components or whatever. Start simple. Test if page loads. Test if post request to that endpoint returns to 100. Test if validation works, so don't forget to test good and bad scenarios. But even if you write 5 or 10 tests, it's much better than 0, and from there you can iterate, you can write more with time, and when you get to the complex test, then you make it more complex and think a bit deeper. But on the surface, majority of the projects would benefit from just simple so-called smoke tests, just checking the endpoints and routes to work. So yeah, this is my reaction to Benjamin's article. The link to that article will be in the description below. What do you think? Do you agree with my opinion on various things? And what do you think in general about such types of videos? Reaction to tutorials by others? And if you have maybe idea for a specific tutorial that I should react on, put the link in the description below. That's it for this time, and see you guys in other videos.